Good afternoon and welcome to the 2022 annual conference of the Science Business Network. My name is Marilyn Fieschi and I'm the CEO of Science Business. It is my pleasure to welcome you all in high numbers here in a fantastic setup in the heart of Brussels. And we wish you in the online audience were here with us. We promise as soon as we can bring you here with us, we will. I will be guiding you throughout the conference and throughout the program that is pretty ambitious, I have to say. Today and tomorrow, what we're going to do is to run the first public assessment of the Horizon Europe program. Most of you are well familiar with Science Business and especially with our news service. The Science Business newsletter is distributed twice a week across the broad science and innovation community. Last week, we celebrated a fairly symbolic anniversary since the 1000th edition was published. And I just want to remind you that the edition number 1 was published in October 2005. So yes, the Science Business News team has gone a long way. If you're not a subscriber yet, do sign up to the newsletter to receive the next 1000 edition. So Horizon Europe is finally underway. And in fact, because of the initial delays in the launch of the program, some of you may think that it is a bit early to run an assessment of Horizon Europe. Well, not really, especially if you consider that the 2021 work program for the European Research Council was adopted fairly early on last year. Under Pillar 2, a full cycle of application and evaluation has been completed, and just recently, the Member States finally found an agreement to unlock the 2022 work program for the European Innovation Council. So, in preparation of this conference, Science Business has run a public survey and a series of private workshops among the members of our network. The objective was to collect as much feedback, and in fact, we heard a lot of very interesting comments about the expected impact of the program on the European R&D landscape, but also about the grumbling around the application process and the many uncertainties around the UK and Swiss participation to the program. All these findings will be put together in a white paper that will be published tomorrow, and will be handed over to Jean-Éric Paquet, the Director General for Research and Innovation at the European Commission, and that will take place in the final session tomorrow. Before we kick off the debate, I want to thank all the members of our network. The network today brings together over 70 organizations from the public and the private sector across 22 countries, as well as European and international organizations. I want also to thank the partners and the sponsors that make this conference possible, in particular the organizations involved in the Stick to Science initiative that will be launched a bit later this afternoon, as well as the partners in the Science Business Technology Strategy Board and the new Future Proofing Medicine initiative. Finally, the Tresca project. Those are the partners that we want to thank warmly. Throughout the conference, please engage with us. You can do that in several ways. You can ask questions to the speakers using the Q&A function on the platform. You can use Twitter, and you have a hashtag, dedicated hashtag that you'll see on every screen of this conference. It's Horizon Assessment, or just connect with other participants through the meeting hub on the platform. All right, now we're going to kick off the debates, and for that, the first session is going to be dedicated to scientific advice in policy making. And to run this conference, it is my pleasure to welcome my colleague Simon Pickard, the Science Business Network Director. Simon, is the science and policy interface under pressure? Tell us about it.
Thank you very much, Marilyn, and a warm welcome to our online audience. And it's a very good question, one that I hope we're going to be able to get some fresh insights and thinking about in the next 25 minutes or so. The choice of theme is quite an automatic one. In the last 2 years during the COVID-19 pandemic, but also around other complex challenges such as the climate crisis, the worlds of science and policy have become arguably more interconnected than ever. But on the other hand, scientific advice and evidence in the policy realm has come under unprecedented scrutiny and also become something of a lightning rod in various parts of mainstream and social media. So the purpose of our opening session today is to kind of take stock of how the science policy interface is holding up under the scrutiny, but also the pressure and the need for quality scientific advice as we struggle with some of the great challenges of our day. And so, to join us for this opening discussion, I'm delighted to welcome two eminent figures in the field. First, Professor Nicole Grobert, who is chair of the group of chief scientific advisors for the European Commission, and from the other side of the Atlantic, Professor Rémi Quirion, who is the chief scientist for the government of Quebec and also the president of INGSA, the International Network of Government Scientific Advisors. So a very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for your patience while we ironed out the little IT glitches, and we're delighted to have you with us. So let's start with the state of the art and your perspectives on how you think the science policy interface has changed in the last 2 to 3 years. The opening question to you both is whether or not you think the current mechanisms and processes have been holding up under pressure, or are there some issues that we need to consider to make the science policy interface even more effective and stronger going forward? Nicole, let's hear from you first.
Thank you so much for your very kind introduction, and I'm delighted to be here to present my thoughts, our thoughts, and also engage with some discussion on science policy. As a scientist at heart, I think it's quite a very exciting time to be in, to see how science advice is basically out in the world there, and people are aware of scientists providing advice to policymakers. At the same time, it's also now the time to shape science advice for policy making, because through the pandemic, we had to act quickly. We had to do the best we could at the time and provide scientific support for policymakers. Yet now, if the pressure eases a little bit, we should start to think on how to perhaps improve existing mechanisms and procedures that we've been putting in place in an ad hoc manner. And for that, we need to distinguish between the acute phase or longer term outcomes. So science advice in an emergency would be different from science advice that provides strategic advice for longer term policy making. And this is basically our role as for the group of chief scientific advisors. Our role is to look at the longer term strategic scientific advice, where the evidence gathering of the science that we use to produce recommendations takes a longer period of time. So that would not be suitable for acute phases where you basically need the answers quickly. And to just briefly describe that, what it means there is no answer or that fits all. So there's not just one solution that gives all the answers and not just one model that we can use, but we need to look at what is actually required by the policymakers, and we need to think beyond the emergency situations and prepare for a better ecosystem on our science advice.
Thank you, Nicole. Now, Rémi, let's get your thoughts on this. Has your time, your attention, and your wisdom come under unprecedented levels of demand? How has it been on the other side of the Atlantic to cope with the requirements of the last couple of years?
Well, first, thank you very much. Really a pleasure to be with you. Thanks to Science Business for the invitation, and a pleasure to do the session this morning to share the screen with Nicole. Of course, and I agree with what Nicole mentioned. I think over the past 2 years, daily, discussion with public health, for example, with Ministry of Health and all that. And often the data that we had, at least at the beginning, were quite limited about this very new virus. What should we do and all that? So it created a bit of confusion among high-level policymaker, elected official, and of course the public as well. So my take on that after these 2 years. Yeah, there is difference when you are in emergency situation compared to the more, I would say, a quiet time, if there is ever a quiet time. But I think what needs to be built is trust between the various groups. Trust, high-level policymaker have to trust you. The elected official have to trust you. And also you as a science advisor, different type and form, have to have a lot of resilience also to be able to navigate during these difficult time. So on my side, my take now, maybe things that will change in the future here in Quebec and Canada, is to be more transparent with the public. So basically to advise being very transparent. Yes, you need to be close to government, but not too close for comfort either. So the public have to see that there is, you provide science advice. It's not you finally that make the decision, and your advice are really public, open, and transparent. And it's hard to build these things under emergency. So you need to have a system set up in peacetime, I'll say, to be able to be more flexible during, if there is an emergency, when emergency happens.
Thank you, Rémi. So I think this actually raises a really interesting question, which is how, as scientists and as scientific advisors, you cope with the short-term pressures that Nicole has referred to in responding to public emergencies, be they health, be they environmental or other. And of course, we've seen a huge level of confusion, constantly evolving and changing scientific advice, masks being a classic example. So how do you build that into the way that you engage with policy institutions and with elected officials to try and frame the uncertainty or the doubts about the scientific evidence that's coming your way in huge volumes, but in a rapidly changing field? Nicole, what would your thoughts be on that? Sorry, you seem to be muted, Nicole.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes, so as a scientist, we're used to dealing with uncertainty, and we have a fairly good feel of how certain we can be with regards to our own research. When you're science advisors, you have to deal with all sorts of topics, be literate in the science communication. So you have to learn how to communicate very clearly, very transparently, and you have to be able to say what you know, what you don't know, and what's uncertain, and explain how you came to the conclusion in terms of what's uncertain and what's simply unknowable. So that's a very important skill to have, and very crucial when it comes to building trust with society and also the policymakers.
Thank you, Nicole. Rémi, I presume it's a similar point of view from your side of the Atlantic.
Very, very, very similar. Trust, transparency, be humble, and really make clear what you know and what you don't know.
Very good. Okay, so we're going to come back to some of these questions about communication, platforms, media, skills, etc. in a short while. But maybe we can think about the question of public trust in science itself for a minute, because I think, internationally in the last couple of years, a number of figures have risen to prominence. Chief scientific advisors like Patrick Vallance in the UK, or chief medical advisors like Mark van Ranst in Belgium, or Anthony Fauci in the US. And I wonder whether this kind of spotlight or a media spotlight on individuals providing advice at the highest level of government detracts us a little from the role that scientific advice can play throughout governmental systems as a whole, and whether or not we need to be thinking now about how this can be tailored and adapted to different levels of government, all the way down to the local context. I know, Rémi, this is something you feel quite strongly about, so let me give the floor to you first to share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very important to be able to build a capacity in terms of science advice in the various departments in a government, not necessarily just like a science advisor for the whole of government. So we have to be able to count and to have experts in every department of a government. And also the type of advice you give, at least my experience over the past, now it's almost 10 years, advice that you give to a regional, in Canada, provincial government and a national government is somewhat different from the advice that you give to a city, to a very local type of government, where they have to solve very acute issue. Let's say you have flooding. Well, you cannot write a PhD thesis about flooding and all that. They have to solve it, try to solve it right away. So providing advice at different level and training people, building capacity, because we don't have much capacity in terms of advice, type of advice that you need to give to a more type of local government. So that's certainly very, very important. The fact that we were very much in the press with elected officials so since the beginning of the pandemic also changed the way, because for me, for example, started to be on TV often, kids writing thing on street, making my face on the street, these times I was not used to that at all. So that's great, but at the same time, there's a price there because of course you're challenged much more. Say, why did you say 3 weeks ago that mass was good and now you're not so sure? So I think explaining one of our job we have to do is to explain the scientific methods to high-level policymaker, elected official, and very important to the public. That's not necessarily the result of the day, that's key. It's more the process that we follow in science.
Very good. Now, Nicole, obviously the work of the group of chief scientific advisors takes a slightly more long-term perspective, right? I mean, it's really a kind of foresight exercise as well as trying to anticipate certain scenarios that would support the European policy agenda. So do you find that you have a very receptive audience for explaining scientific methodology? Is it a barrier to getting through effectively to policymakers and elected officials that you have to start with the basics of how you arrive at your conclusions? How do you approach that as a group of advisors vis-a-vis the longer-term European Commission policy agenda?
Well, what is really important is the communication between the scientific advisors and the policymakers, and both parties need to be open and receptive to other views and ways of explaining things. But it's been quite an exciting journey to see how sort of the recommendations that we have produced over the years are welcomed and are indeed useful for policymakers to turn that into policies that are then to the benefit of society. I would like to make a jump back to what Rémi said earlier about training people. I would push the challenge out a little bit further and not just look at that interface, scientists and policymakers, scientists and society, but go right back to school times where I think we need to create an environment where science becomes a strong component of culture, where it becomes natural and normal, and the easy choice to think scientifically in order to sort of solve problems, of course, taking cultural backgrounds into account. But it becomes a natural for maybe some scientists who are skilled in communicating science, also to embark in that direction and get scientific sort of career incentives for people to do that, but not expect every single scientist to become a science advisor because not everybody is good at it. And but from a career perspective, it's sometimes quite hard for scientists to embark on scientific advice because then you don't have the time to produce your research output, your funding income. And I think we need to take a systemic approach in order to improve this whole engagement of scientists with policymakers and have society play a bigger role in this as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, before we move on to some of the skills capacity and also some important media questions, I do have a question for Rémi, which is more in the North American context. Now, obviously, one of the big stories that's sort of spreading throughout international scientific communities today is the news that Eric Lander, the chief scientific advisor to Presidential Biden, is stepping down. So without focusing on the issues why, does this change anything, do you think, for the North American science agenda? And by extension, Rémi, you know, Lander was the first cabinet-level appointment. For scientific advisors, is it healthy to be that close to the heart of government? And what do you think is sort of an ideal model for this going forward? Is it specific to countries and regions, or do we need to keep a greater sense of distance?
It's a very good question, and I think it's, of course, it's unfortunate because with the previous administration, science advice was not at all top of the agenda. So with President Biden hoping that will rebuild that, so certainly that's hard. That's a difficult day for science advice, I would say, not only in the US, but globally. Hopefully, the president will react quickly and appoint a new person there in charge of the office. Is it a good thing to be at the same time kind of cabinet level, minister level type of appointment? I will say no. My own bias would be you need to be close to the elected official, high-level policymaker, but also at some distance. And you need to be transparent with government, of course, but also with the public. So I think to be minister, it's a little bit like what we have, for example, here in Quebec. The head of public health is a deputy minister. And during the pandemic, we have seen that sometimes probably was not the best thing to always do the press conference in the presence of the premier or minister. So if you can be able to do your kind of science-related press conference, and maybe then the government have also their own press conference. But always to be together, I think, is too close for comfort. So I think that's probably the kind of a model that INCSA is supporting the most. But of course, depending on the country, the model may be different.
Fully understood. Okay, thank you very much for that, Rémi. Now let's devote the last few minutes to the question about science communications in a turbulent media environment or a public communications environment. The next session in the program is going to address topics including misinformation, fake news, questions of public trust. But a question to both of you: what do you think can be done to improve the communication of science in the public domain? Are there any quick wins or easy ways to make the value of science, the rationale, the methodologies, and the potential impacts of scientific findings more relevant to the public? Nicole, perhaps to you first.
That's a very difficult question to answer. I wish there were a quick fix. We just have to continue to do our very best to communicate transparently and clearly in a way that it's accessible for the wider audience. And I think that the same what I said earlier about science, there are certain scientists who are incredibly good at conveying the content of the scientific findings to a general audience. And then there are other scientists who are not so good at it. And I think it's all to do with the training of the scientists, but it's also it's a two-way process, also to do with the training of the people and what's happening at schools. So I think schools play a fundamentally important role in this aspect, especially when it comes to how to evaluate the science that is out there in the social media and the misinformation. So we have to be very clear about what is misinformation and what isn't. Yet if somebody is convinced they believe a certain thing, sometimes you can't reach these people. And there, I must admit, I'm currently struggling to find a solution how to reach these people.
Very good. Well, Rémi, I mean, it's Nicole's referenced the importance of not taking a one-size-fits-all or a universal approach to say that every scientist must receive intensive science communication training. But should we build this into assessment frameworks, do you think, in terms of scientific careers? What do you think would be relevant in terms of incentivizing, particularly those who are good at it or who have a real enthusiasm to do it, to be recognized and rewarded, as Nicole has suggested? It shouldn't necessarily be for everybody, but it should be for those who can do it and who want to do it. How could we tackle that problem?
Yeah, and I will start by saying I agree very much with Nicole that more on the long run, long term, what's key is scientific literacy, education from primary school to university. That's a way to kind of fight disinformation and fake news. Improving scientific literacy at every level. We're not there in most countries, so we have work to do there. Then in terms of scientists that are good, that want to do it in terms of communication with the public, communication with elected official or high-level policymaker. I agree as well, it's not for everyone, and we should not say it's part of your mandate now or of duties as university prof to do that. It will do more harm than good, I think, with some of the colleagues. But the one that want to do it and do it well, we need to find a way to reward that, also to recognize that when it's well done, it's extremely important. And I say often to colleagues here in Quebec, in Canada, or at INGSA, that the scientists who do that well, the impact that they have may be much higher than a great paper in Nature, for example. But we need to find a way to, yes, to continue to reward paper in very, very strong, very good journal, but at the same time, find ways to recognize scientists that give a lot of time to explain their science or to explain science to the public and to government. So we need to do that. It's a change in culture, but I think it's critically important if we want to succeed in fighting, for example, disinformation and fake news.
Very good. Now, one related question, which is actually from a member of the audience, and I think it's quite relevant here. Do you think it's possible to build trust in adversarial contexts? Is the question. Right? And the link is that the advice on using the AstraZeneca vaccine obviously resulted in very polarized public debate, a media debate about the potential risks or the potential rewards of taking AstraZeneca. So perhaps not necessarily focusing on AstraZeneca's vaccine exclusivity, how do you address this question of positioning scientific advice in the middle of a very tense and sometimes conflictual media and public environment? Nicole, would you like to go first on this one?
I would like to, but I couldn't hear the majority of your question. There's some interruption going on. Sorry.
Very good. So in brief, is it possible to build trust in adversarial contexts? And the example given by the member of the audience was the AstraZeneca vaccine, resulting in very different policy decisions, risks, and very polarized public debate about the risks and rewards of it being adopted. So in this rather tense, conflictual media environment, how do we position science advice neutrally in the middle?
So in conflicting situations, how can we convince people what the right thing is to do? That's certainly not an easy one. I think one has to start trying to understand what the people's concern is, and then building on their concern to come up with evidence that they hopefully find convincing, and then make the point that way. But it's not an easy task. It's a huge challenge, and especially if the split between the opinions is rather large, then it gets even harder. But all we can do is provide scientific evidence and try to present it in a accessible and digestible and convincing manner.
Very good. Okay, Rémi, a final comment from you before we move on to the next session.
I will just add here that, yes, very challenging when you are in the middle of that, but you have to be very open again and transparent and humble and saying, on the basis of the data that we analyze, that we have now, this is what we know, this is what we don't know. And the bottom line, according to today's knowledge, will be that we should follow plan A instead of plan B. But being very humble and making sure that people understand that you don't have all the required information to be able to say without any doubt, this is the way we should move forward.
Excellent. Well, on that note, it's time to bring our opening session to a close. So I'd really like to thank both of you, Nicole and Rémi, for sharing your insights and experience and thoughts with us today. This is by no means the last time we're going to be revisiting this topic. And I think actually the European Commission has a big summit on science advice under pressure in late April. So please do have a look at the work that both INGSA and the Commission is doing in this field. So with that, I'm delighted to wrap up this session and hand back to Marilyn in the studio. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you to Nicole and Rémi for this very insightful discussion.